Now, a three-point model. Firstly, we're going to have the harms that we ascribe to the laws legally that exist in the criminal system, where it is what the state endorses when they legally send someone to prison. We're not going to endorse things, for example, like prison sexual assault or gang violence in the realistic conception of these prisons in general. The reason behind this is quite simple, is that it will be extremely politically unpopular for any state to follow those demands, and it's extremely unlikely for this to happen. Second, is that we're going to have counseling afterwards. When individuals exit these prisons, they're able to get counseling in order to get to delineation. I also think delineation effect fades in the foreseeable future when the societal norm of going to this type of prison is established. And thirdly, obviously, we're still able to impose other type of punishment upon individuals. These look like things like patrol, things like house arrest, things like restraining orders that prevent individuals from getting back into their victim when they're being released. These are effective tools that we use in sentencing, and these are independent from the years of sentencing themselves. And obviously, as per the model, we're going to give them a relatively short amount of time. If you get sentenced for, let's say, 20 years, you now finish that in 3 years in the virtual prison that exists. I'm going to bring you two arguments that exist. Firstly, I'm going to talk about how the current system is horrible and is disproportionate and is unjust. Second, I'm going to talk about prison incentive as a structure and directly do the comparative. Firstly, I want to hit is why is the current prison system not a suitable way for individuals to get punished? The reason behind this is that a sizable amount of our prison system involves things like prison assault, either through physical terms or through sexual terms that individuals are getting sexually assaulted. It also means that drugs flows horribly that exist in prisons. In cases like COVID pandemic, individuals are disproportionately punished because they're being crowded in certain areas that make diseases more likely to be fostered. It also means that individuals don't get basic access to sanitary that was provided by law in general. It means that there are a lot of illegal things, and this is obviously what the judge does not endorse when they put individuals into it. And this is something you cannot solve by regulation, because there's little political support for regulations that exist in these instances, and oftentimes prison guards self-select because they have sadistic nature that they opted in to be prison guards in the first place. This means self-selection is incredibly difficult. As a result of it, we have literally millions of people that exist in the social structures that we've created that endorse in an exorbitant amount of harm that is not being measured by society. Society also don't give a shit about these harms because they don't have access to political capital, and it's politically unpopular for you to care about these victims, for them to unionize and in order to form a political bloc. What does it impact this? Firstly, I think upon the principle, this means that the punishment imposes them is disproportionate, which is not proportionate to the crime that you created. You're just punishing them for the sake of punishment. And there are also things, there are realistic impacts that exist in this, in which individuals are going to feel marginalized, right? Because they find a hatred in our society that are being treated in such a way. It also means that rehabilitation is less likely to happen when they're actively endorsed in this instances. I also think upon a humanitarian perspective, this is egregious and is an independent reason why this should be solved. Secondly, to note is that this oftentimes leads to a formation of gangs that exist upon current prisons. This looks like individuals who's able to formulate gangs, for example, white supremacies that exist in a lot of prisons, or gangs that is involved in criminal activities that exist. This is something you cannot prevent, because if you put enough criminal in a concentrated spot, it is likely that social structure is going to arise. What does this look like? It means that a build up of a system of networks. These are people that you interact with, and when they get released, are likely to be the people you interact with when you come out of prison. And these oftentimes leads to a system of internalization that is across decades. And you hear about their success stories, the stories that did not get caught, the glorification of crime, the existence that this leads to a huge amount of wealth and leads to some sort of a vengeance effect that exists. All of this gets internalized with the decades that you're being inclined to exist. It means that recidivism is incredibly high, and any effort or rehabilitation doesn't necessarily exist. Certainly, is that your labor is then going to be disproportionately punished because your skill set is now going to fade away 20 years from now that exists. How are we able to solve it? The first thing is that there are strong political incentives for you to not put people into rape cells, right? The reason behind it is that the state necessarily have to endorse every sort of action that is creating those virtual prisons, and that is extremely politically unpopular. And second of all, there are no real people that exist for now, so you're able to directly adjust the political demand that exists. Oh, go.
If you have the fiat power to replace all prison sentences with virtual prison, why don't we have the fiat power to implement reforms that lower the likelihood of these abuses, like better screening for guards and better ability to report these abuses?
We literally just talked about the structures why that's unlikely to happen. Given that A, a lot of times there's a self-select that happens, and B, oftentimes we have tried a lot of reforms, it just didn't work out that exist, right? moving on to impact layer, I also think that when there are no real people, that's when these gangs no longer can formulate. I also think that now we're able to reform and we're able to add specific job trainings to these individuals and they're able to adjust this. At the end of this, what we're able to do is we're able to create a CGS system that is more rehabilitative, that is proportionate to the crime we have created rather than draconian one, which are disproportionately punished. Second thing I want to talk about is how you're able to, second thing I want to talk about prison as a political system and incentive it creates. Because the prison industrial complex, what necessarily exists is that not just political action, to the extent that so many security guards are collectivizing, to the extent that so much political capital are coming into the same place, what it necessarily means is that they're able to collectivize political capital and able to nudge governments in a way that is that the government does not want to be nudged in the first place. So this looks like stronger incarceration of individuals. We're having a long sentence for individuals. They have two incentives to do this. Firstly, they have a profit incentive based upon the number of years individuals are daily sent into private prisons that exist. Notice here that this necessarily means that individuals are likely going to be this means that they're likely going to want to capture more individuals and send in individuals for longer. The classic example of this is the three-strike laws that exist in California, in which even for a minor crime, you're likely going to be sent into a permanent life sentence. And also, that these prison industrial complexes are able to extractionate from very notion of labor that comes from you in the first place, right? It looks like cheap labor that do not have to pay you within minimum wage. It looks like putting you into dangerous jobs that exist in the status quo. How do we reverse this, right? Because in the comparative world that we're able to use this as technology, that's when prison industrial complex loses their incentive in order to chain people for longer. Because likely going to shift upon technological companies who are likely going to exist and who are likely going to create themselves. They're also likely going to charge an exorbitant amount of money that exists of these prison industrial complex. Because technology is not that expensive as compared to this. Even in the hypothetical world that this motion exists, it is likely that this technology is somewhat mature and relatively low, is somewhat mature. So this means that cost won't be a significant problem that exists. It also means that you cannot just extrapolate labor anymore. So it removes the incentive structure that makes the prison system egregious in the first place. At the end of this, we live in a society where millions of individuals are subjugated to an act of harm that is not sanctioned by the law, in which that this leads to further recidivism in the future upon the ground of protecting crime. I think that's an independent reason for you to vote Gov. Very happy to propose.
I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for those final remarks. I'd now like to welcome the Leader of the Opposition to introduce the case for the opposition bench.
Okay, I will take POIs in the chat, please. And I will start in 3, 2, 1. For all that government wanted to say in regards to prison abuses happening on our side of the house, I think they failed to recognize that even if this is just a simulation, it is still someone who is going to be experiencing a very terrible experience. Insofar as prison, if it exists for deterrence, is supposed to be you being subjected to really bad things. You still have, when you're put into the simulation, the experience of your freedom of movement being deprived, the experience of the power imbalance between you and guards for potentially years. I think this is going to have a huge mental effect that is largely symmetric if you consider what prison looks like on our side. But the most important thing, and what we're going to form our case around, is the potential for political will for prison reform or prison abolition that they do not get on government side when audiences don't perceive this simulation to actually be that bad. That's going to be just the main framing I want to give. Most of my rebuttal is going to be integrated, but the first thing I want to note is that if they are going to overhaul this whole system, lots of money going into creating this tech, paying programmers, ensuring that these people's material needs are still being met insofar as they're still being plugged in, I think those resources that are new should just go to actually making the prison system that already exists better, insofar as we can have better screening for guards, ability to report abuses. These kind of things can happen on our side of the house. Prison, as it exists in the material world, can get better. The question is which one is more likely to actually, play out better long term. Great. So let's just get into the case. The first one is going to be what's happening in the status quo, meaning that prison reform is likely on our side and that they do not get on theirs. The question that I think you need to ask yourself in this debate is, why do people commit crime in the majority of instances? Opp says that the reason there is recidivism on for individuals who are getting released from prison is because of the fact that they meet other individuals when they're there and then they get into prison gangs, and that's the reason that they commit crime after the fact. We don't think this is true from opening opposition, maybe in some instances, but not in the vast majority of cases. Crime is an incredibly high-risk activity insofar as you are always going to be under the risk of actually actively being incarcerated, being removed from your friends and family, often coming under death or threat yourself, or putting your own loved ones at risk as well. We think that the main reason people opt into doing these activities is because there is not an alternate path for them to pursue, for them to meet their material needs or their material happiness, and like also provide for their loved ones. It looks like the majority of individuals coming from impoverished backgrounds who feel like they have no other choice but to opt into these activities because they don't see another path for their prosperity that is accessible to them, because there is just a lack of state resources going towards their communities to ensure that these kind of things are going to be fixed. I think, sure, some of the time it might look like you meeting someone in prison, becoming friends, and then returning to crime after you get out. This is not the main reason, though. What it looks like is people getting out of prison and not having the ability to continue to meet their own happiness. I think what they'll likely say in response to this on government is that, well, at least we're not taking their job away from them now, but the fact of the matter is that only applies to individuals who already had a job, who already had ties. You still, on their side of the house, have the knock on your record that says, I was someone who committed a crime. You still are going to have the emotional distress that comes with actually being incarcerated in the simulation, which means recidivism is likely compared on their side. The problem is, though, that what happens is that you do not allow people to actually put resources towards alleviating the actual cause of the crime, which leads to, I think, two impacts. It means that individuals are going to have terrible experiences in the simulation that are going to be even longer, that are not going to be addressed, when they're going to get less sentencing on our side long term. And secondly, it means you don't stop crime, which means you get even more victims on their side because you haven't actually addressed the causes. Before I go on, I'll take POI from closing.
The vast majority of gang crime is funneled through prisons. When prisons don't exist, isn't that a pretty good thing?
Gang crime, sure, if you want to say you don't get gang crime anymore, that's fine. What you need to prove, though, is that that is the majority of reason that crime is happening, and that's just, I think, fundamentally not true. Great. So what does this do in terms of perception? That's, I think, the most important thing. I think it is very hard to empathize with someone when they tell you what it's like to be in a simulation, insofar as you do not know what it actually looks like to exist in that computer. Like, I think the intuition pump for this is that tech isn't understood by most people. There's a veil of ignorance or confusion about why this is going to be exactly like the same kind of thing that you would experience in the material world, which means even if you have individuals like reporting to other people like in newsletters or whatever that say this experience is really bad, that's just something that's hard for you to empathize with, insofar as you're saying, well, you were just gone for a couple of days. That doesn't seem like a big deal. I have no idea what was going on in that simulation. This is something that I think plays out in two places. I think Off says that the reason that people are incarcerated on their side is a profit incentive. We don't think this is the only reason. I think, first of all, the way that this narrative plays out and people don't understand what it's like to be incarcerated is that those on the right come out against this with a tough on crime narrative. The reason people feel like crime is something that is scary to them is because, you know, it deprives you of your rights if someone like actually if you're the victim of a crime. I think what people value about incarceration is the perception that a dangerous person has been removed from the streets, something was done in response to the thing that actually happened to them. Now, individuals who want to weaponize that perception by the public to win elections, insofar as they can say, well, we're not actually making sure that these individuals who harmed those in our community are facing any kind of harm, they're just being plugged in for a couple of days. That's something that I think uniquely captures the emotion of the public. That means they are more likely to vote in favor of having more tough on crime sentencing, more tough on crime narratives, just in case you need to ensure that the deterrence of these people who are doing these bad things is going to happen. At the same time, the other thing that happens is people on the left who are pro-prison reform in the status quo now don't see it as important as well, because of the fact that they're saying, well, it was just a couple of days, you still go back to your family and friends, if you had a job, you still have that. That's probably a better comparative. They lose their own emotional ability to rally and say, no, we should be responding to these kind of things, making sure that they're actually going to be fixed on our side, getting lower sentencing. That is happening in the status quo. Prove that in a second. Go ahead, opening if you have one.
Why can't liberal activists get famous people to experience this and then report back?
I mean, I guess you could. I don't know why you would just get one famous person to come out and suddenly that is going to solve the entire thing I told you about the right weaponizing this narrative, insofar as people still don't know what it is like and people can be viewed as just being like bought out. There's no reason that's going to prove to everyone in the public that that means the simulation is bad. What are the impacts then of this when you have people on the left not feeling that this is as emotionally important and people on the right trying to win elections and say that this is a bad thing? It means you get less political will for prison reform in the status quo. Things like decriminalizing drugs, things like welfare programs, community investment, and job programs, which actually ensure that individuals who would opt into crime now do not do that because of the fact that they see another path to prosperity that is lower risk and a higher reward, insofar as you're not going to lose your friends and family. It also means 3, ensuring people aren't going to be imprisoned unjustly, i.e. racist sentencing isn't viewed as a big deal when it means that you're just like being plugged into a simulation for a couple of days, as opposed to having a lot of things deprived from you. I think it is okay for this to continue on our side. It means long-term sentencing is going to go down because all of these individuals are still facing the immense trauma that comes with like actually facing prison and having your freedom of movement deprived. I think what's going to happen is that people are getting on board and will get on board with this in the status quo. When you have places that have like horrible prison abuses like America, looking at Scandinavian countries, you have a growing will for the actual reform in prisons that's going to be lost on their side because it's not viewed as bad. I think what you then see as a result of this is longer sentencing because people are saying, well, we need to make sure that these individuals aren't going to do bad things, and that means you need to have higher deterrence effect rather than these sentences going down. And you also don't see resources going to plug the actual issue of the crime, which means what happens on their side of the house, even if they incarcerate people, is that more victims of crime happen because you haven't actually solved the roots. Proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the leader of the opposition for those final remarks, and I'd like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case for the government.
Panels, in my lifetime, I have seen a sea change in prison abolition where individuals have looked towards greater solutions and greater alternatives to prisons. But this debate is not about that. It's about the aberration of rights that exist in the status quo when prisons are physical manifestations of hell, when individual criminal syndicates can take over prisons in Latin America completely, where prisons in the status quo in Canada and the United States are hotbeds for white supremacist recruitment, and when individuals have to recidivize after going to prison because their human capital has been deprived, because over the years they spend in prison, those are torturous years they can never get back, where their earning capacity goes down, and when they get diseases in high likelihoods because there is not enough sanitation, because there is not enough funding, because HIV runs rampant through prisons and sexual assault likewise. So the first thing I'm going to deal with in this speech is the question on politics. OO's assertion here is that they can counterprop away the issues within prisons. But we told you structurally, no matter how much fiat you use, those things cannot be fixed. The first is the largest elephant in the room that has the largest amount of political will. Those are prison unions and private prison companies that get the source of income and their only existence through the existence of prisons themselves. We told you if they are physically removed, they are gone completely. But can you fiat past them and reform them? They say, well, you can just screen for guards better. But who actually wants to become a prison guard is someone who already has the proclivities could cause harm, but also secondarily, that the culture around that leads to worse outcomes. That is why it is incoherent for them to say we can reform prisons, but also wanting to be the prison abolition team. But thirdly, that we told you it is the physical manifestation in a lot of these issues that causes the problem. For example, no matter how much reform you do or how much watching you do, sexual assault in prison has always existed to some extent because of violent vector and place. And even if you can catch the assaulter afterwards, the harm has already been done. What is the violation here is they don't understand. It's not about whether or not we catch the individual who committed assault in prison. It's about the fact that it has happened and it is additional punishment that no judge in their right mind has inflicted upon that individual. Why is it asymmetric on our side in the political space route? Because even if prisoners are a politically unsympathetic class, I don't think people want them to be assaulted. The reason it exists in the status quo is they can say, well, that's just prison. We aren't the ones actively doing that as voters, as the state. Whereas on our side, if you put that into the simulation, you are actively making that worse. The last claim here on politics is they say, well, you are going to get less sympathies because you cannot empathize with technology and technology costs a lot. The first thing to note here is that one of the largest changes in torture, for example, was when Christopher Hitchens went on television and got waterboarded and showed everyone on live television what happened. I think you can strap someone reasonably famous for an hour, force politicians who make this incredibly onerous to experience the simulation in a way you cannot make them experience 20 years in prison. And this is when our 3 days to 20 years analysis is deeply important, because these individuals are the ones who gained that. In the 3 days, you can strap a right-wing politician in and ask them how they feel afterwards is the change you can get. And I think that leads to people who are in power actually having empathy, rather than the long link chain, which has huge probabilistic holes that activists can somehow create marginal change, that somehow creates worldwide change and national level changes to prison conditions such that we can fundamentally change them. I'll take OO.
Yeah, so being deprived of your rights for 20 years is something that's intuitively bad for people. I think left organizations now have to choose between putting their resources towards things that are very clearly a rights abuse versus prison reform, which is deprioritized when it's not viewed as uniquely bad for these individuals. The activist thing is symmetric to your side as well.
So the problem here is this. That is predicated on these activists being successful in the status quo, firstly. But second, and I already explained why the link chain is really questionable and how much prison abolitionist activists actually can effectuate change. But secondarily, the direct response to this is that in the comparative world where you have to fight and change multiple prison systems over multiple jurisdictions versus one computer program, which you can change at the flick of the code, is much easier. Okay, I'll take CO. CO,
just for
please.
clarity, the individuals who are inside these prisons exist with other cyber individuals. There's no kind of contact you can have with a real individual.
Yeah, so you would interact with fake prisoners, therefore you cannot form criminality. The next clash I want to deal with is recidivism and how it happens. They try to murky out this clash, which ultimately is not something they can win off, is first to explain, in that even if the majority of people recidivize for economic reasons and other reasons, we are the team that controls those economic links, because the economic loss of 20 years in prison, where there's a huge gap in your resume, or let's be more modest, 5 years or so versus 5 days of lost income, is huge for these individuals. It means a lost income and lost career trajectory. It means not seeing your family and having those connections. They say, well, there might be a world where they don't have those connections, but in that world where they're destitute in both worlds, one, we are winning that because we show you the criminal connections you make in prison are deeply disconcerting, and they are oftentimes the ones that are against your own volition, that they push you and prey on you in your most vulnerable aspects to recruit you into ideologies that are dangerous and into networks that do not work for you but rather harm you. At the end of this, prison and the endpoint to this analysis is that recidivism is worse on their side because they exacerbate the economic harms and the criminogenic elements and all of that. At the end of this, prison was a uniquely bad institution in the status quo, where the physical manifestation of its buildings and income stream meant it was politically untouchable. So do not say that the political capital is symmetric, because it is not. When we can abolish these companies and these physical unions, we can change the system.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for those final remarks. I'd now like to call on the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to continue the case for the opposition bench.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I'd like to be very clear about one thing. When Gov says that we get to now abolish the kinds of private prisons and like guard unions that push for longer sentences and worse conditions, that's actually not true, because the motion is very specific that people who get life sentences would still get in-person prisons, like would still get, like real prisons and not the virtual ones. What this means is that now these people, instead of they don't just go away, now they just push and lobby for more things to be considered life sentences. They now just push for the expansion of prisons and the expansion of the life sentence so that more people are pushed under it. This is not an impact where they get to win. If any anything, this is a point for our side because it adds to the political will of people saying that we need to make sure this is really bad because it's really dangerous to have people back out in the streets. For all that OG says about how bad prisons are, they respond to very little of what Emery told you about how things are on balance going to get worse for prisoners in their world at the point at which there is this narrative of needing to keep people off the streets in a way that currently is not being fulfilled. So let's talk about political will and how it shakes out. So what do they say about political will? I think I've already dealt with the first thing they said about political will, which is that, oh, we want to, like prison guards are currently pushing for this harm. I think I've shown you how that doesn't go away in their world. And if anything, prison guards now have to push for something even worse now, because now the only way they keep their job is if sentences go up. That probably means they're going to push very hard for it. And since OG is premised on these prison guards being successful in their lobbying, that probably does just mean more life prisons. That's probably a bad thing. The other thing they say with regards to political will is like, oh, you can have like a celebrity experience a simulation and then just say how bad it is. I just don't think it's very likely that you're going to get a celebrity who's willing to perceive that they're like suffering for 5 years of their life just to make a point. And that's like a huge sacrifice that very few people would be willing to do. This is probably just kind of symmetric because like presumably you can tour prisons right now and have prison exposés right now, whereas and in their world you can just like demonstrate how bad the simulation is. So like that part of it seems symmetric. And then the other thing they say is that like the process of reform is literally easier because all you have to do is like flick a switch to change a code, and it's the same for everyone. And like I mean, like maybe it can be changed, but note that like if they have the fiat power to like entirely remove most real prisons, I think we have to be given symmetric fiat power to some extent, which is why the response of prison guards and like their political will being an obstacle is not something that can get in the way of our, like you are basically counter-propping that we can do things like have better screening for guards, that we can do things like like have greater ability to report things like sexual assault and have people who who will actually take this seriously and believe them and put systems in place of accountability to deal with that. The only response they have is that, oh, guards self-select into being bad people. I mean, maybe they'll try to, but surely not literally every single guard who applies for the job is an abusive asshole. Presumably some of them are just people who want a job. We can interview them and monitor them more closely to make sure that we only have the good people. This is not a response. I'll take CG.
We're going to assume you guys have perfect political capital, even then there's a time gap problem where it takes 10 years to study a prison to figure out what works. In our world, it takes a week.
Okay, but I'm sorry, this just seems like mitigation. Like maybe it takes a while, but we can still figure it out. All right, so what does Emery say about political will that gets very little response from Deputy Prime Minister? What Emery says is two things. Firstly, that it is hard to process how bad a simulation is, and even like them saying like a celebrity can experience the simulation. Again, I just don't think that's actually going to happen. No celebrity is going to want to like suffer that much in order to do it. Like Christopher Hitchens is probably unusual. I can't imagine many celebrities are cool with being waterboarded on live TV. And two, Emery tells you that this means that people want dangerous people to be off the streets. What happens in their world is that one, left-wing parties see this as a lesser priority because there's a general perception that this isn't as bad of a harm to suffer through. And secondly, right-wing people think that there is active danger and that there is active danger and these people need to be punished more and they're not being punished enough. They need to be incapacitated more. What does that mean? So that means that in their world, there is one, more pressure for life sentences, both from the right wing and from prison unions themselves, meaning that every bad thing they say about prisons, every abuse that happens there, that they probably can't fiat out because they've used the political will to transfer some of the prison sentences to virtual ones. The people who still go to prison get worse life sentences. But what it also means is that there is more things like vigilante justice at the point at which the people aren't satisfied that these people have been actually punished. So when these people get out of prison, they're likely to be attacked on the streets because they feel like this is a bad person who hasn't been punished enough. We also think that victims are likely to be deeply unsatisfied, that victims are likely to feel like the person who hurt them wasn't punished enough. This is a psychologically horrific thing to have to experience, and we don't think this is something that these people deserve. I think the other thing that happens, though, is that the simulations are just very bad and there's very little political will to reform them. This means that like the degree of trauma that you experience from being in the prison is going to get worse, if anything, or at very least stay stay the same. But the other thing that there is less political will for in our world, and this is where we're actively winning, is on things that can actually solve the root causes of crime, because they want to tell you, no thank you, that the only main cause of crime is that, sorry, I really just don't have time, I'm sorry. They want to tell you that the main root cause of crime is like people meeting other people in prisons and doing recidivism as a result. But Emory tells you why that's not the case, and they don't respond. Emory tells you that crime is an extremely risky thing to do, that you are putting yourself and your loved ones at direct, enormous risk. The only reason you're going to do that is because you really, really need to, and that doesn't go away in their world. It does go away in our world when you have more things like welfare and job programs. I think these things are likely because over the last few years in much of the West, we've seen the unprecedented rise of a progressive movement with Black Lives Matter putting things like the legalization of most drugs and the removal of the life sentences into the public conversation for the first time. That is something, that is political will that you remove in their world when you make this punishment seem not that bad, and when you think that there are dangerous people out on the streets. We think in our world, there's far more likely to be things like welfare that actually address the root causes of crime, because it allows people to address their basic needs without having to turn to crime. I will concede that maybe some gang crimes go away in their world, that you don't meet people in prison that cause you to get into a gang lifestyle to the same degree. But I just don't think that that is the cause of the majority of crime. And the only other thing they say is like, oh, you get to keep your job now. But like Emory already told you and they didn't respond, oh, if you already had a job, you probably weren't doing crime in the first place because you didn't need to. I'm very proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition for his final remarks. I'd now like to call on the Member of Government to extend the case for the government bench.
Hey, do I sound okay? I'm not echoey.
No, you sound good.
Thanks. I think we're going to start by accepting the premise of opening opposition, which is that they do have a lot of fiat power to be able to introduce the reforms that they want to introduce, given the nature of the motion. What I think is important from closing government is that even if right now we have the capacity to just redesign the entire prison system, we literally don't know how we design it because there's so much we yet have to discover about human psychology, about criminology, about what works and what doesn't, and lots of different scenarios. I think the most important thing is the flexibility and ease of change which you get through this motion, which is the first thing I'm going to look at about specifically why being able to have simulations creates much better outcomes. First of all, I just want to, in terms of this clash of do prisons get better or worse, I want to engage with a couple of the points that have come up before and add on a few things. The first thing is opening government fairly point out that the private prison lobby is a massive reason why it's hard to just fiat regulation. I think what they miss though is that even if you accept that opening opposition can just like counter the lobbying because they have a lot of power to introduce the reforms they want to implement, the reason that the private prison lobby is so pervasive is not even directly lobbying the system, it's because they have so much capacity to be able to influence the mind of voters who then push for things in the long term because they constantly persuade you to be like pro-long sentences and pro-criminalization in lots of instances. The response from opening opposition, the implicit response which opening opposition already gave is, well, they said, well, they'll push for life sentences and that gets much worse. I just want to call out how disingenuous this is, as in like people who go for life sentences are such a tiny, tiny proportion of all prisoners, but notably like voters don't want to live in a world where you feel unsafe if you commit a petty offense that you might be able to be subjected to a life sentence. Like there's so many reasons why from a self-defense perspective that is abhorrent to voters. That's not the thing they're going to push for. In the vast majority of cases, the vast majority of people who go to prison for things which are much less serious and they get subjected to all the harms under the status quo. So I think that's how we win on that clash. But in terms of why prisons get better, I think the most important thing to point out is that the big reason why taxpayers don't want to support investing a lot of money in creating support systems, which we know would probably work, is just because it's very expensive, right? Because it takes away from them. Importantly, when you're designing a simulation, designing a really terrible prison takes the same amount of coding and investment in the kind of computer technology development software as developing a really luxurious prison, right? So you can make decisions literally based on what the kind of outcome is without having the vested incentive incentive of taxpayers being like, well, why is my money going towards giving all these luxurious conditions and things that will help their quality of life, because that's taking away from me. You remove that incentive to distort the way it happens. But secondly, again, the ease of change is so much easier, because the reasons that in a real life physical prison it's just genuinely hard to change structures is because you have things like sunk costs that you've invested so much in those structures, because you have policy legacies, and the way institutions are set up means that it's much harder because you've already invested in the things which are there, and therefore you want to see them continue. Again, this is so much reduced when it's literally coding as opposed to investing in new physical structures or like retraining people, because you can design it so much more easily, which means you have the flexibility to do that. I think this is important, particularly given Hamza's POI, which says you can learn much more about the prison system effectively when you can like test lots of things in a week over a decade. And then the response is a bit glib, like we'll figure it out eventually. Like human psychology is constantly evolving. The nature of social networks and crime are constantly evolving. We're always playing catch up if we don't know what works, because we have this massive disadvantage in terms of being able to measure the outcomes of policies that we take upon ourselves. So I think it's a massive impact to be like, you can measure very, very quickly what's going to be successful and what's going to work, and be able to be flexible because you don't have the massive backlash against investing lots of money in these kind of structures when you can you can get better outcomes in this way. Lastly, I think in terms of why prisons get better, that is specific to it being virtual, is because you can tailor different experiences much more easily. Right now, we have different types of prisons, right, that exist, that run different models. The thing is that you're locked into which kind of prison system you go through geography, right? Just like literally what's near you is the place that you get sent, which means that you can't be sent to a type of prison that would best cater for your specific needs and like what kind of things you've done. The categories are very, very broad. When you remove the geographical aspect, you can send people to prisons which are going to give them services which are much more tailored to their specific needs and their specific experiences. Note, standardization of prisons necessarily happens when it's physical, because you have to be geographic. But when prison services are standardized, you necessarily play to the most violent, most dangerous offender, because they're the ones you want to prioritize doing, which is why then you get all the harms imposed on people who are in there for smaller crimes, but they're treated like incredibly dangerous, violent offenders, which is why you get all the impacts of feeling like a criminal, of making your identity then be formed around criminality because you're being treated like something that you're not. The difference is you can have much more specificity with where you put people, because it's just much easier when it's simulated versus like what's in your area and where you have to go to. No, I also want to point out all these benefits which I've said about being able to research, being able to be flexible, being able to improve conditions in prisons, which is much easier when it's coding, is a spin-off benefit for people who are actually in physical real life prisons, because you learn so much more about what the conditions are going to be like, and then there's lots of incentives to be able to enact that, because everyone does at the end of the day want prisons that work successfully. It's just that there's so many barriers right now to finding out what will work successfully. I will take a POI from OO.
Virtual prison is still really bad when people can't empathize with that experience. You get political will for longer sentences with worse conditions, because people are worried if it's not really shitty, they'll just return to crime after. You haven't dealt with any of that.
Right. I think, first of all, I just think when you invest in this technology, it's much more incentives to make it accessible, right? Because this is part of education. Like you can be like, you go for a day, you experience the prison. Like it's so much easier to be able to do that versus like you go and visit around a physical prison where you aren't able to experience that. Like also on this whole celebrity thing, I don't want to get distracted by this, but this would literally be the biggest publicity stunt ever. I totally think celebrities would be into this, and to use OG's idea, to be able to talk about what that experience is like. I think when you make the experience of prison much more accessible, you get more empathy versus right now where you literally have no capacity to be able to understand what it's like. At least now you have an option, which is likely to become more accessible when you invest in this technology. Okay, I actually think that one of the biggest impacts in this debate is not actually about the prisoners themselves, which this whole debate has focused on so far, but is about their dependents and the benefits of being in prison for a short time. Before that, I will take CO.
We still don't necessarily understand why an experience or access to this experience through virtual simulation means that people necessarily care to make a change that specifically looks like prison experiences becoming a whole lot better.
Right, but I think the reason why you want reform is that everyone wants a society with less crime. So if we can, it's easier to achieve those ways, then people want to be able to do those things, and that's kind of the priority. I think in terms of why there's a benefit of short time to prison, so fair enough, OG said it's harder to get jobs. I also think like the big thing is like a cycle of debt, right? So if you're in prison for decades, there's no one to support your dependents, they get into lots of debt when you come out, therefore you have to commit more crimes. But I think the biggest impact is on children, right? Because it's a massively destabilizing experience to have your parent taken away from you, the person that gives you psychological security, that gives you your biggest role model and security in your life, to go for a long period of time. I think there's lots of reasons why the children of prisoners are much more likely to convict themselves, because when your parents in prison for like a decade, that seeps into your identity and you feel like it's part of, like it feels like it's something you're much more connected to, as opposed to when that harm is limited to like a few days, and then it is much less likely to seep into your identity, and you're much less destabilized by the absence of a stable role model, which is literally a lot of the difference between being able to achieve things in life and being able to not achieve things in life, because you don't have that emotional security and connections, as well as the economic economic stuff. I think it's about who you leave behind, particularly given the people who are most likely to go to prison are minority men, which means the double bind on the women they leave behind, then look after the families, look after the finances, while they're away for decades and decades and decades in a prison sentence, which is a massive harm imposed on them. This is something you eliminate when you make prison sentence shorter, which is incredibly important for those dependents. I'm very proud to propose this motion.
I'd like to thank the member of government for those final remarks. I'd now like to call on the member of opposition to extend the case for the opposition bench.
Thank you, Chair. Please just give me a second to quickly set up my timer. Yeah. Oops. Starting in 3, 2, sorry, before I begin, could I ask that the other competitors unmute themselves and say POI to signify that they're giving a POI, because it's difficult to continuously focus on the chat space. Thank you. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, this debate emphasizes time as well as the impact of time on a person's sentence, as well as the overall prison experience. We think the government team seemed to overburden themselves a lot by assuming that this one aspect is really significant and impactful enough to completely change a lot of the structural injustices that they have characterized. But overall, we think that therefore, what this means is that a lot of the analysis that they provide on the likely impact on their side is very abstract and likely not true, because we think that they specifically assume that a lot of the incentive structures that they characterize are in fact probable. But we don't think that, for example, that just being an simulated experience of prison means that people firstly have an incentive to engage with that simulated experience and therefore care enough to want to change the problems that exist. Because we think what is likely the case is that the same incentives and feelings that people have now will likely remain the same. The primary actor in this debate, therefore, are the prisoners, and what the impact of this experience, as well as the impact of the change in how time operates through this experience, therefore affects them, and most importantly, their victims. Cool. A couple of issues of direct rebuttal. Firstly, just with respect to the case that we get from government, please note, panel, that in response, we simply say that these issues that they characterize are true. However, it is not just to create a panacea through sentencing specifically. The reason for this is that the existence of prisons is not why abuses take place inherently, but extensively would say that criminal justice systems are based on the categorical imperative to punish wrong and protect society from one's willingness to do harm to others. Therefore, we say that there is a need for people to be in prison, and thus there's an obligation, and thus the obligation should be to challenge the inadequacies that enable these abuses and crime to flourish. For example, having a collaboration between the state and the private sector, as opposed to extensively privatizing prisons. For example, allowing prisoners to unionize. For example, paying prisoners better for the labor that they do. Please also note, panel, that if these fundamental changes, if these fundamental reasons rather are not addressed in comparison, it means that even with this method or this system of a simulated prison, these injustices are likely to continue, for example, through things like bug software, where the results of what is in fact happening aren't necessarily what is going to be displayed. It means that there will always be people who aren't properly held accountable, who are able to use the system for injustices that harm the prisoner anyways. The second thing is that prisons, on the analysis on prisons as a political system, we would still argue that there must be prisons, especially in comparison to our opening, which is specifically to say that we must still keep prisoners in prison. The comparative here is that you challenge the system's injustices in prisons in general over a long time, as opening government claims. The reason why this is still a better comparative is that the change is of general application and doesn't establish a preferred class among people who categorically all should receive punishment of equal measure for being people who have allowed themselves to commit harm in society. This then brings me to my extension. And the question I'm going to answer is why time is an essential aspect of serving a sentence. The first reason here is that time is what signifies the consequences of the sentence. The reason for this is firstly, that prison is not the worst case scenario. Often, in spite of a person's intentions for committing a crime, the offender commits the crime knowing that there's the chance they will go to prison, and that is something that and therefore they consent to that action, that crime, in spite of this understanding. Secondly, we say that, like the Gov bench argues, prison has concentrated criminal communities. Therefore, people often form part of a community or already know people inside. This means that prison itself is not the worst case, but secondly, people have ways of mitigating the experience and forming community. The third reason, not now, is the second argument. The second sub-argument is why is time therefore specifically essential? We say that firstly, it contributes an experience of loss. OO tells us that people know that there's the prospect of loss when they commit crime because they have like families and interests that they wish to pursue, often by funding them through crime. What we'd say is that even the worst lose in this instance the best years of their lives and or like their capacity to like head their crime syndicates or even experience the wealth that they plunder. What this means is that physically being away from the real world for a long time is an inconvenience with tangible outcome. Especially because in prison, even time or a sentence that is short is often extensive enough to have impact. For example, being a parent or like a boss or like a spouse and being away for a long time, even just for 4 months, has an emotional and practical outcome because life goes on without you. Before I proceed, I'll take opening.
Yeah.
So
deterrence is still go.
So, given we gave you a principle that over-punishing happens in the status quo because things like hepatitis rates are not priced into the law.
I've already addressed this to say that sentencing isn't the problem behind that. So you never address the fundamental issue. Therefore, problems that lead to bad punishment, to extensive punishment and ill experiences will always continue, even under this method, i.e. bug software, all that lot. The second argument on why time is specifically essential is that with spouses and parents in particular, the guilt of missing out on time is an incentive for people to change. That's why we see prisoner reach out programs that specifically help people connect with their loved ones in order to incentivize them to change. Before I proceed, I'll take closing.
Even if you get reform on your side, even in the best case, you still have to wait decades. In our world, you have to wait weeks. Isn't that important?
That's okay, because it means that we still operate under the categorical imperative to punish people for doing wrong and not making sentencing or the experience of the sentence easy for people. Cool. This brings me to my last argument on how this dilutes justice. We say that victims panel often want and emphasize the retributive aspect of punishment. That's why, for example, restorative justice in countries like South Africa have often failed because there wasn't an instance where the offender was punished for the crime that they committed. We say that in this instance, if the person only experiences that sentence for short days and they're able to go out of that assimilation, it means that there isn't in fact extensive punishment that separates them from their victim and the overall society that they harmed or made or inconvenienced through their crime. We say that in this instance, this situation doesn't take into consideration the people who ought to be protected from one's will to commit ill against society. This is an injustice. For all of these reasons, very proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the member of opposition for those fine remarks. I'd now like to call on the government whip to conclude the case for the government bench.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Am I echoing?
Oh wait, put in.
I'm just checking. Because if I'm not, I'd rather just not wear the earphones. Is this fine?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, great. Closing opposition and opening opposition really like waiting. They like waiting to see what happens when you have a new generation of criminals prop up 20 years from now because we didn't enact reform soon enough. They're going to wait to make sure that racial justice policies come through so that Black men don't stop going to jail for crimes that they often did not commit or crimes that they did commit for disproportionately higher sentences. They want to wait, and we're telling them we need to stop waiting and start getting things done ASAP. That's what Kira's extension was about, at least the first half of it. There is a temporal dimension to this argument where even if we assume perfect political capital on both sides, perfect capacities on both sides, it just becomes a game of who gets things done sooner. And Kira uniquely shows to you that that change is much more likely vis-a-vis simulation than vis-a-vis prisons in the real world. The first thing I'm going to do is take out CO, then I'm going to discuss our way up with OG, then finally talk about OO. Firstly, closing opposition's argument about feeling a sense of loss doesn't work for 3 reasons. One, it can't be a sense of loss in a psychological sense because the info slide literally says that you don't know that you're in a simulation. So you're in prison for 20 years in a psychological sense. But secondly, it doesn't make sense insofar as loss should only be felt if loss is justified, right? We just don't think loss is justified in this case, where disproportionately the impact of that sense of loss is felt by people who can't pay the rent anymore, whose families are kicked out of social housing, whose families where mothers and sisters disproportionately take up the load of economic and social responsibilities because minority men go to jail, right? So the sense of loss does make sense in a retributive sense, but it doesn't make sense in a general social sense because these people disproportionately suffer the impacts. But the second thing I would intuit is retribution does exist insofar as they are in that prison chair for 7 days, but the victims know that this person is suffering the torture of being in there for a decade. I think that's almost retribution at its finest, where you get the realization of this person suffering without the guilt of, I screwed up this person's life forever. So if anything, I think this is better for victims. Let's talk about opening government and how we win against them. We win against them for 4 reasons. Firstly, we mechanize all of their arguments about reform. Kira uniquely shows to you that irrespective of whether there's a private lobby which exists, a private lobby is only operational if it has public support. A public support doesn't exist in their world, but exists in our world, the point at which we show to you that taxpayers don't have to foot the bill anymore. And if taxpayers don't have to foot the bill anymore, then they're much more likely to support reform. What does that mean? If you're coding a simulation, whether you have a clean toilet in the simulation or dirty toilet in a simulation takes the exact same amount of coding. Whether you have a library in the common room or a table tennis table or a boxing ring in the common room takes the exact same amount of coding. So we can simply nudge towards behaviors we think are desirable over behaviors which are undesirable for the exact same amount of money. But secondly, Kira says that policy legacies, sunk cost fallacies, status quo biases, all mean that citizens are much less likely to favor reform in a way that they don't do in our world. This is why we mechanize reform. The second thing that we do then is prove the ease of change argument. That it's essentially easier to do this the point at which you have fundamentally a spatial problem. And the spatial problem is as follows, right? It just takes so much more time to figure out what works in prisons because we can't wait every 2 decades and say this is the newest sociological development. We can simply test it in our world. For these reasons, we mechanize the reform argument and win on that. But the third thing that Kira says then in terms of mechanizing reform is that we can tailor these experiences now. Like often where you go to prison depends on where you commit the crime or where you are born. That's absolutely horrible. Now you can go to prison simulations which are much more tailored towards your experiences as opposed to going to the same prison just because you happen to be in a certain community because you're near a prison which is for high violent offenders. And I think that's really, really terrible. We win on reform. But secondly, Kira shows to you that every single argument about theirs, about prisoners on opening government, about prisoners doing worse is most bad when it's about the most vulnerable people who are around these prisoners. A, these people are important, such as children and women, because they are disproportionately impacted by what happens if these guys go to prison. But 2, they did not choose to commit the crime in the first place. So if anything, in an ethical sense, we should care much more about them. For those reasons, we are also winning against opening government. Before I deal with opening opposition, I'm very happy to take a point of information from them. Go ahead.
Yeah, given that you don't prove the likelihood that reforms that are actually good will be implemented, if you make the simulation nicer and crime doesn't go down, that just means that the right gets the political will to both raise sentence time and make the experience worse. You have to prove that you're going to actually ensure these things happen.
But Emily, that's really disingenuous, right? Because you can't spend the entirety of your positive material being like, if you have so much fiat, so do we, and then say we don't have fiat, right? Like if we have symmetric amounts of political capital, then we get the reform. So the intuition behind your positive case is against the intuition of your POI there. But in any case, I'm going to give you 5 responses for why opening opposition's case doesn't work. What is the central claim behind opening opposition? Empathy and sympathy for these people goes down the point at which they are in simulations as opposed to real life spatial constructs. I'm going to give you 5 responses here. One, this assumes that we both need the same level of political capital, but we don't, right? Because for reasons that Kira has given you, a programmer switching a line of code just requires much less political capital than getting $1 trillion influx of funding. Two, I'm very happy to trade that off, because the point at which you do get reforms, there's this necessarily temporal dimension but still exists. So even if it's the best prison like Sweden with PlayStations and fucking fudge brownies or whatever, you're still going to jail for 10 years and your family is still abandoned. That's a huge problem on our side. So even if you do get reform, we can simply trade that off. I'm going to take one more POI from OO for engagement. Go ahead, give it another shot.
So we think that what you're saying on loss is very disingenuous in this debate. We think that the experience of physically being away is something that is of inconvenience, so therefore does qualify adequate punishment, because it's important that people experience the ramifications of their actions.
It makes sense, but then why are you punishing the experience of going away to the children and women who never committed the crime in the first place? Is sort of the point I'm trying to make, right? Like, I understand that someone else committed the crime, but the disproportionate impact of that punishment goes on people who never consented to it. 3 more responses towards opening opposition. The third response then, in terms after trade-off and capital, is the intuition behind prison life sentences, right? Where they try to say, like, life sentences now become the next big thing, and the Republican Party tries pushing that for everything. I have 2 responses. One, glibly, 1% of crimes are life sentences, right, guys? And then secondly, also remember that most crimes are non-violent crimes. Like, it's impossible for me to imagine a life sentence somehow coming into existence for a non-violent crime. So that doesn't apply to the vast majority of crimes in any given debate. But secondly, Kira uniquely shows to you, and this is really important, that we can use simulations as a benchmark to improve real life prisons. We literally can now test out millions of simulations and say, this is what works in the prison, this is what doesn't. This means then that even in their best case scenario, where some more people go for life sentence prisons, these are better prisons in our world. We've shown to you that vulnerable populations are the ones most worthy of our moral concern, and we've shown to you several reasons why reform occurs in our world. For that reason, we take it above opening government and the opposition bench. Very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the government whip for those final remarks. I'd now like to call on the opposition whip to conclude the case for the opposition bench and indeed the debate as a whole.
Hi, I just want to check that I'm audible.
Yeah.
Just setting my timer. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to start off by rebutting the closing government's case, because although they didn't extend us the same kind of liberty, I think engagement is incredibly important. On this, 2 responses. Firstly, their argument is the ease of change. What they say is that it's important that we have this kind of technology because we can easily just change it at the push of a code. They make the insinuation that this is somehow going to be cheaper, which number one is incredibly unclear given that technology is incredibly expensive, especially at its inception, where it would require significant amounts of input of money essentially to totally rehaul a system. So I don't really understand where the argument of it being cost effective is. But secondly, because the kind of labor that's required to actually change code is not just that simple as just changing code, right? If you've ever hired someone to like change the coding or to recode something, it's incredibly expensive. These guys are people who, number one, are very few and far between, particularly if we're talking about a new technology and a very specialized technology. This means that there's a handful of people in Silicon Valley who probably have the expertise to just radically reform this code, especially in an efficient way such as you demand. But secondly, they're probably going to cost you really exorbitant amounts of money, right? Because big tech, or the people who are skilled enough to just recode these very complex systems, like probably have really, really big checks that they require you to pay and that they require the government to pay. So on the idea of cost, at best, it's symmetric, but number 2, it's quite illogical, because even when they tell you that, okay, what's important is that they don't necessarily have to concede that there could be harm in their world as well, but what they argue is that this harm is more repairable. Number 1, if you're going to argue that the benefit on your side is you can constantly monitor and can therefore reform, this again means that you need a handful of guys in Silicon Valley who are constantly watching these systems and are constantly evaluating if they're actually working, thus that they warrant some kind of reform or change. change, right? Because recognize they don't say that in their world they're just going to start off perfect. They just say that if a change needs to happen, human psychology is incredibly complex. We have to constantly evolve. They then concede that they require some kind of constant input of monitoring, some kind of constant input of skill set that can rectify and respond to the problems that will exist even in their system. But more on this, right? Because I don't think that it's as simple as they're trying to make it out to be, because of a couple of reasons. Number one, if we're looking at the actors, so they say that reform isn't possible because in our world that reform doesn't really look like, or that reform is quite delayed and we're not even sure what that reform really looks like. That's not really true, right? We're quite sure what that reform looks like, because the problems that they're talking about isn't even one of reform within the prison system, it's reform within the criminal justice system at the level of the courts. Because their problem is that it's unfair that there's mass incarceration of Black men in America, and this means that people are being disproportionately harmed for acts that they didn't even commit. That's definitely a problem, and we don't deny that. However, the response to that is not one at a prison level. It's one at a sentencing level, because it's awful and morally abhorrent that the response that we give to that problem is, okay, sure, we'll just put them in virtual systems where they're still probably going to be psychologically oppressed for 50 years for carrying marijuana. The nuance here is to say that the reform that they want is, again, one that happens at a courts level. It looks like the decriminalization of marijuana, for example. It looks like lesser sentences. It looks like actually giving people access to things like lawyers. All of these things are things that advocates are already advocating for, that are generally outside of the scope of the prison system in general, and that would adequately respond to these changes. They just require an input of money, which on your side is still required for you to put in this technology, particularly if you want it to be at such a great degree, right? But lastly, we're dealing with nefarious actors in this instance. Because what they say is that, look, it's bad, and opening government also says that, look, it's bad that we have this because it means that people in private prisons, or rather private prisons are the ones who have now got the capacity, or in our world, private prisons largely have lobbying power to counteract any progressive legislation. On your world, it's significantly worse, because the primary actor you have are the guys in Silicon Valley. There are people who are managing big tech who have proven that they are nefarious actors, that they're unaccountable to government policies, and that they can genuinely like harvest people for information, right? So this brings me on to my second level of rebuttal. They say we can tailor these kinds of we can tailor the kind of punishment to people. Number one, guys, that's a terrible idea, because that literally leads to grounds for torture, particularly when you make the concession that the way in which prisons work is that people have different access to different things based on their resources, and that prisoners are particularly vulnerable because they don't have the political capital to have people care about them when things go wrong. This actually leads you to abuse. It means that you can just psychologically torture these people and send them to a simulation like The Good Place for your own enjoyment if you're a programmer of these systems. They say that you want different kinds of systems. Number one, they need to actually clarify what that means, because again, that's reading down to really problematic lines, because it's likely that someone like Harvey Weinstein can hire really good and skilled programmers to give him a really comfortable prison and a nice prison, whereas someone who still lives in an area that's resource deprived won't have as good of a system, or someone who cannot afford the private prisons that will still likely have a competitive advantage will get a really bad prison. They say that they don't see why prison sentences should be standardized. There's really good reasons, because the reason why we have prisons in general is because we warrant punishment, but we say when we infringe your rights, because those are now being taken away because you infringe the rights of someone else, there's still a degree to which we can do that. So it means that you still have to have healthcare, you still have to have food, you still have to have basic amenities, but the difference is that these are standardized for everyone. That's why we use time, because using things like psychological torture is something that can be unregulated, and that's when the harm occurs. I'll take one from the European government.
Yeah, epistemically, time spent is symmetrical. Additional punishment needs to be weighed with a significant moral harm that is created by higher recidivism rate from labor disconnect at the school of crime. People not becoming victim of crime is more important.
Okay, no, cool. So I don't think time is symmetric on your side, right? Because of the same reasons that you say, and because of the extension that quite frankly goes unengaged. Because what Lindo tells you is that time isn't just important because you spent 50 years in prison, because even under your own analysis, prison generally isn't that bad for a lot of people, right? And even in your world, you're making prison generally quite neutral. What qualifies that time is that you miss your child's graduation. What qualifies that time is that you were 20 when you went in, you're 40 when you come out. So time qualifies that punishment for it to actually be a genuine means of serving some kind of retribution and for it to even qualify rehabilitation, right? You just make this claim that people will be rehabilitated. But if I go into prison, I'm 20 when I went in, I'm 21 when I come out, nothing in my life has significantly changed. What then warrants that I don't go and recommit a crime? Because generally I haven't really lost anything, which is contingent on your side proving all the benefits that you want to prove, right? Lastly, I just want to talk about when they talk about it's unfair that the children of these individuals are harmed disproportionately. Number one, I think this is a gross mischaracterization, because while we can say there's some kind of harm that children and families incur, we don't take away from that. Number one, that can be and is already modeled out by like welfare systems that protect families of prisoners or mentorship programs that protect the children of prisoners, right? That's already something that we can do without reintroducing completely new policy. But the reason that that doesn't stand is because, again, it's not that these children are disproportionately punished, because the people who still are primarily punished are the perpetrators. It's terrible to have your father go to prison, but it's even worse for you to go to prison in and of itself when you are the father who misses all the things that that child is experiencing, right? So we think that it's really important that we don't grossly characterize the important act in this debate. Very proud to propose.